Carter's heart abruptly clenched. For the very first time in his life, he discovered exactly how terrifying it was for a voyeur to be caught. Almost instinctively, Carter closed the surveillance, not daring to look directly into Melvin's eyes through the interface. It took him a while for the numbness prickling the depths of his heart to dissipate, and before he could consider how Melvin knew the position of the surveillance, he hurriedly got up and ran towards the front door of the library. When the prison guard stationed by the staircase saw Carter appear, his right hand moved towards the baton by his waist, following behind him. What happened? Without a turn of his head, he ran towards the recreation room, going to check it out. Carter could only think of one possibility why Melvin had called him over to the recreation room in this manner. He should be trying to engineer the facade of being violated, letting Carter witness all of this, then have Princess accused of sexual harassment. But there was a problem with this still. Even if Princess was put in confinement, he would only be locked up for a few days at best. If Melvin set up Princess in this way, it would be a cure for the symptoms but not the cause, and would conversely incite Shay's wrath, inviting even more trouble for himself. The distance between the library and the recreation room was only about a dozen meters. It wasn't enough to give Carter time to calm enough to think. He expected that Melvin would act like a victim when he pushed open the door to the recreation room, but the result was poles apart from what he imagined. The rebuke was already on the tip of his tongue, yet he saw Princess standing 2 meters away from Melvin, looking Melvin from head to toe with disgust on his face. Carter was, for a time, unable to make sense of the situation. The rebuke he prepared got twisted on his tongue, finally changing into a harmless sentence. "What are you doing?" Seeing Carter and the other guard, Princess rolled his eyes dramatically, his expression complicated as he studied Carter, then brushed past him to leave the recreation room. "What's going on?" the guard who had followed him over asked. "It seems to be nothing. I thought that something would happen." Carter's mind was still filled with a confused fog, but he didn't forget to give an excuse for running over. "Help me look over the library. I'm going to have a few words with 117. This prison guard was stationed on the second floor every day and knew that Carter and Melvin were on somewhat good terms with each other. He didn't press the issue, making an okay hand gesture and leaving the recreation room. Only Carter and Melvin remained in the narrow space. Carter let out a sigh of relief, but immediately frowned after and looked towards Melvin, asking, "What's going on between Princess and you?" "Dealt with it," said Melvin, relaxed. Carter distinctly remembered that before he shut the monitoring software, Princess was even squatting in front of Melvin. How could Princess' attitude have undergone such a huge transformation in a time as short as a minute? "How did you get him to give up?" Carter asked strangely. "I told him that I'm a bottom." The air in the recreation room congealed. Carter's expression stiffened. He stared at Melvin disbelievingly. The gears of his mind swiftly spun, and he finally thought of another possibility for Melvin to call Princess over to the recreation room. No matter what he did, except to refuse Princess' advances, he would get into Shay's bad books. So the best solution was to make Princess lose interest by himself. Melvin had deliberately called Princess over to the recreation room, a private space, to raise Princess' excitement to the peak, then dousing icy water over Princess' head. As for the reason why Melvin would call Carter over was probably that he wasn't completely sure of Princess' personality either. In the event that Princess refused to give up, Carter's appearance would be just the thing to extinguish any last bit of flame. From the looks of it, Carter didn't even have to come over at all. Melvin's move had already caused Princess to completely lose interest. Carter pursed his lips into a thin line, unsure whether to ask, the words catching in his throat. There was clearly something more pressing for him to find out than that. "How did you know?" Carter temporarily calmed the billows tossing about in his heart, slowly speaking. "About the surveillance camera? Are you talking about that?" Melvin walked up to the cabinets, raising his eyes to look at the messy stacks of newspapers cluttered on top of them. "It's obvious, isn't it? The whole recreation room was empty as can be, with only 2 cabinets placed in the corner. If hidden surveillance was to be installed in this room, it would have to be concealed near the cabinets. The cabinets were light green tin cabinets that formerly used to store mops and other paraphernalia, but now housed inmate snacks, poker cards, etc. There were 3 slits on the upper side of the cabinet doors, behind which a pinhole camera could be installed. However, as these cabinets were often opened by inmates, it wasn't possible to install a camera there. The most inconspicuous spot would be above them, Melvin said. Once you determine the range, it's easy to find the location of the camera. Carter turned his head away, looking out of the windows, and exhaled, saying reluctantly, "So did you already see through it that time with old Nine?" "Nope, it was just a guess," Melvin said. "Ah." Carter looked at Melvin uncomprehendingly. Was it possible that Melvin had acted contrary to what he analyzed, bringing Princess to the recreation room without a proper plan in place? "Let me tell you a secret, Officer James." A corner of Melvin's lips subtly hooked up. "The monitoring software can be hidden, but it also can be found." "Got it." Completely busted. The corners of Carter's lips twitched in frustration. Keeping tabs on the score now, he had failed to hide 2 things that he wanted to hide. First being that he was Melvin's neighbor, second being the surveillance he installed in the recreation room. However, luckily for him, he hadn't exposed the matter of his voyeurism yet. Melvin shouldn't know that he had already been observing his every action on the sly from more than half a year ago. That's to monitor the inmates. Carter lifted his chin, gesturing towards the camera above the cabinet. "There isn't any surveillance here. I'm afraid that something would happen." "Your attentiveness in fixing the oversight is commendable, Officer James." Melvin nodded approvingly, yet somehow, Carter kept feeling Melvin still had his reservations. Carter abhorred feeling this way. He kept being exposed in front of Melvin, one thing dropping after the next. It was as if his clothes were being torn off him piece by piece, and he was left only in his underwear, whereas Melvin was still meticulously dressed and completely impregnable to him. It was unfair. "Officer James," Melvin called hold of Carter, "let me tell you another secret." "What secret?" Carter unconsciously paused in his steps, his ears perking to listen out for movement behind him. The word secret always made people pause to think. Associating this word with the topic at hand, Carter's thoughts started to spiral uncontrollably again. Could Melvin really have some kind of physiological condition that caused him to be unable to top? Distracted thinking about physiological conditions, Carter didn't notice that Melvin had already walked up behind him. Melvin's arms encircled Carter's shoulders, bringing him into his embrace. He lowered his head to breathe into his ears. "If you're curious, you can try it for yourself, Officer James." After saying this, Melvin dropped his voice further. "No one else is here now." Caught completely off guard, Carter knocked into Melvin's chest, and he unconsciously clasped the lower arms that extended in front of his chest. Back when Melvin was boxing, Carter habitually used his monocular to observe the raised blue veins jutting up on Melvin's arms as he felt that they looked very sensual. And now these arms were in Carter's hands. His palms could feel the heat emanating from the skin, and were even touching the blue vein lines. His heart involuntarily stuttered, but he didn't have time to digest it properly because he could understand the subtle implications behind Melvin's words. Although he deeply hated this side of himself, his mind uncontrollably started churning utterly indecent filth again. Clearly, Melvin hadn't done anything much to light the fire, only encircling his shoulders and speaking in his ears, but it was as if all his strength had been drained out of his body. It felt difficult to even stand. Was it really still about his voyeurism? To a voyeur, intimate contact with the object of their voyeurism was simply irresistible. Carter couldn't pull the brakes on his mind once it started. Countless stimulating visuals appeared before his eyes. His thoughts drifted further and further away, like an untamed horse tossing off its reins, galloping into the wilderness, whilst his sanity humbly screamed in a cramped little corner. It was only when Melvin spoke from behind him again that Carter's consciousness was abruptly jerked back to reality. "Officer James, what's on your mind?" His lax eyes suddenly refocused and he forcefully pushed Melvin away, his shame morphing into anger. "Are you insane? I'm a prison officer." While this sentence sounded like a warning to Melvin, it was better called a warning to Carter himself. He didn't dare to meet Melvin's eyes. He was clearly fuming with rage, but his gaze kept darting around. His guilty conscience was plain as day for all to see. "Officer James." Melvin suppressed the smile on the corners of his mouth. "You really don't take teasing well, huh?" Carter also knew that he was acting weird. Melvin didn't even do much to him, and his mind had already auto-filled all sorts of indescribable visuals. He didn't even realize that he was actually a person with such an easily combustible attribute. To hide his guilty conscience, Carter unhooked the baton from his waist, glaring at Melvin. "Try laughing one more time." Melvin raised his arms in mock surrender. "I don't dare." In a twinkling, Carter abruptly became aware of a problem. He was unable to hold his own against Melvin. There were inmates of all sorts in Southside Prison, but it was just as if Melvin was Carter's natural predator, subduing him at every turn, and he was utterly incapable of resistance. Carter resolutely decided not to speak with Melvin anymore, keeping his baton and leaving the recreation room. The air conditioning was on full blast in the admin block, but when Carter glanced at the sunlight roasting the concrete outside, he couldn't help but loosen the top 2 buttons of his uniform. God damn it, why was it so hot? Princess was no longer around by the time he returned to the library. Carter notified the prison guard that had helped him watch over the library, then under the many gossipy, busybody gazes, sat back in his work area. Coming in after him, Melvin still sat at the first row nearest to Carter, on which still lay his unfinished comic book. In the past, Carter used to wish the afternoon to get by faster so that after the inmates left, he would be free the rest of the afternoon. Today, however, Carter was staunchly opposed to the arrival of 2 o'clock. Because the moment it turned 2, only he and Melvin would be left alone in the library again. He had just escaped from the suffocating recreation room and didn't want to be alone with Melvin again, but it was useless to run away from reality. After other inmates left the library, Melvin came to his side again. "Officer James, won't it be very uncomfortable for you like this?" Melvin asked. The work area was overly cramped. Whenever Carter or Melvin relaxed, their knees would inadvertently bump against each other. Since Melvin refused to close his legs, then Carter's 2 legs were tightly pressed together, and his knees were pointing towards the windows. His sitting posture was even more prim and ladylike than a lady. "No." Carter worked on the Sudoku in his hands. "Go study your stocks." Melvin shifted the mouse, looking at Carter, bored, asking, "Do you need help?" "What?" "You haven't moved in a long time." Carter didn't spread the newspaper on the table but held it in his hands, deliberately avoiding Melvin's line of sight, preventing this person from giving him the answers again. Every time he worked out an empty square, he would make a marking with his pencil. However, after solving the simplest squares, he didn't move for a long time. It wasn't that he couldn't figure out the remaining squares, but that he wasn't even in the mood to figure them out in the first place. Having the newspaper in his hands was no more than his shield to avoid having to talk more than necessary to Melvin. His plan was to squander the half-hour like this, but he didn't expect that Melvin would catch him daydreaming. "I don't need any help," said Carter. "Oh." Melvin lazily turned his head back, continuing to study the candlestick chart on the screen. But no more than a moment later, he looked back at Carter and he said, "Officer James." "What is it now?" Carter set down the newspaper, frowning as he looked at Melvin. Melvin didn't answer. He only turned over and leaned slowly towards Carter. The frown was still on Carter's face, but the impatience gradually turned into heightened wariness, which, as Melvin continued to press in closer, was complexed with a hint of panic. After backing up to the window, Carter was no longer able to back away. He held a hand against Melvin's chest. "What are you doing?" The distance between the two of them was so close that Melvin's lips were less than a fist's length away from Carter's nose. Carter couldn't help but think madly, if Melvin was going to say that there was an eyelash on his face again, he'd pluck all of Melvin's eyelashes right out. But Melvin didn't touch Carter's face this time. He only stretched out his left hand, pressing it against the window frame next to Carter's ear, then used his right hand to draw the curtains. He said, "The sun's too strong." As Melvin spoke, his chin was lifted and his line of sight was directed upwards at the sliding rail above the curtain. The smooth jawline was placed right in front of Carter's eyes. His gaze dropped, half-lidded, staring blankly at Melvin's Adam's apple, and the impulse to bite it inexplicably arose in his mind. The windows in the library faced northwards. While the afternoon sunlight wouldn't shine in directly, it was true the seats near the windows would feel warmer. Melvin withdrew his right hand and touched the shell of Carter's ear. He asked, gazing at him, "Officer James, do you feel very hot as well?" Carter lowered his gaze without responding, and he heard Melvin say, "Your ears have flushed." "All right." Carter shut his eyes, taking a deep breath. He was completely unable to resist the advances, intentional or not, that Melvin made on him. Even long before Melvin was imprisoned, he was already unable to tear his eyes off this man. At a hair's trigger, Melvin topless, wearing an apron, or searing a steak, every bit of him was able to excite every nerve in his brain, let alone their close proximity now, the Adam's apple and collarbones just within his reach. "Melvin," Carter endured the hoarseness of his throat, speaking softly, "stay away from me." He was already at the end of his restraint. His eyelashes were quivering with the strenuous effort it took him not to succumb to temptation. He was afraid that if Melvin got any closer to him, he wouldn't be able to keep from pouncing on Melvin, and Melvin would completely discover that he was a pervert. After a long while, Melvin replied with an "okay" and retreated back to his seat. The tightness of his airways finally regained the sensation of breathing. Carter secretly let loose a sigh of relief in his head, picking up his newspaper again, this time keeping an even more deliberate distance from Melvin. He didn't say anything, and his lips were pursed tightly into a straight line. Heavy vexation was concentrated between his brows. Anyone could tell that he was currently in a very poor mood. While Melvin was in part a cause behind his less than stellar mood, more of his frustration was directed at himself for being unable to control his spiraling thoughts and the pure filth that automatically filled his brain. "Officer James," Melvin suddenly spoke, "am I making you feel very uncomfortable?" Hearing this, Carter was momentarily dazzled. He didn't expect that after rousing him so badly, Melvin would actually notice his unhappiness and take a moment for self-reflection. "Yes," said Carter. "Sorry," Melvin said sincerely. "I couldn't resist." Melvin stood up. "I'll be off now for today then." Carter detested people like this who would openly and honestly give an apology, because then it was conversely difficult for him to take the crime up with them. He was quiet for a moment, and watching the figure of Melvin's back, he said, "Don't come tomorrow. I'll speak with the warden." Melvin paused in his steps, but he didn't look back as he left the library. Actually, Carter didn't tell Melvin not to come by any more out of anger, but that he objectively judged he couldn't let Melvin step into his restricted area again. If this went on, he would only be flirting with danger. He guessed that the warden wouldn't immediately agree and prepared himself for having to go back and forth a few times. But perhaps Melvin had found some excuse, for unexpectedly he really didn't come back to the library the next day.